on the bus, exhausted from another brutal day at work. But when her eyes snapped open, the world wasn't the same. People were walking around like living candles, glowing flames flickering above their heads, some burning brightly, whilst others were barely alive, blinking hard. Ayuka rubbed her eyes, thinking that she was still dreaming. But just as she tried to steady herself, a cold hand tapped her shoulder. Slowly she turned. The moment she saw who was standing there, Ayoka froze, her breath caught in her throat, her eyes wide in disbelief, because what she saw wasn't just strange, it was something she was never supposed to see. Ayoka was 31 years old, a Lagos banker who lived the kind of life that people praised on Instagram. Her posts were filled with pictures where her smiles never reached her eyes, polished selfies in office suits, and occasional shots of her feet in the sands of Dubai. But behind the phone screen was a woman who was running on fumes. Her job drained her, chewing up her time and spitting out her joy. Her so-called friends turned every outing into a silent battle of who wore the better wig, drove the better car, or took the most expensive vacations. Her parents called every Sunday, their voices full of disappointment. Ayoka, when will you marry? Time is not on your side. You don't want to end up like Auntie Ronke, or do you? They asked Ayoka, whose heart raced at the thought of it. Auntie Ronke was Ayoka's father's only sister, who at 45 was still unmarried, not by choice, but because life had left her in pieces. She had been engaged for 15 years to the man who she believed was her forever. 15 years of standing by him, building dreams with him, planning a life where her love and loyalty would be enough. But one day, without warning, he left, not for a stranger, not for someone from a distant city, but for her best friend's daughter, a girl Auntie Ronke cradled as a baby, bought gifts for, and even godmothered when she was born. The betrayal shattered her completely. She didn't just lose her fiancé, she lost her best friend, her community, and every dream that she had ever clung on to for nearly 2 decades. People whispered behind her back, calling her the woman who wasted her youth and the one who lost to a child. Auntie Ronke stopped going to parties. She stopped attending church, stopped answering calls, moved through life like a ghost, a shadow of the vibrant woman that she once was. And every time that Ayoka's parents mentioned her, it always sounded like a warning that Ayoka could end up like her, a warning that life could pass her by while she's here chasing dreams and drowning in her own quest for success. The thought suffocated Ayoka, who deep down was terrified that she would end up like her aunt. Her work was so demanding, and being in Lagos, the city that eats the slow alive, Ayoka was losing herself. She lived alone in an expensive apartment in Lekki, not because she loved it, not because it made her happy, but because living anywhere else would mean admitting out loud that maybe life wasn't going the way that she planned. All her friends lived in Lekki, so she did too, even if the rent swallowed nearly all of her salary, even if she barely had enough left for herself. That day, the day it all began, had been one of the worst. Her team had been preparing for a major banking audit for weeks, and Ayoka was the one responsible for submitting the final report to the head office. She stayed late, skipped lunch, skipped everything, her eyes glued to spreadsheets and figures until her vision began to blur. And then, somehow, despite all her efforts, she missed the deadline by 15 minutes. Mr. Folarin, her boss, had chewed her out in front of everyone. Ayoka, are you this careless? Do you know what this means for our team? For me, do you want to destroy your career at this point in your life? Every word landed like a stone in her chest. By the time she left the office, night had swallowed the sky, and Ayoka felt like she was moving through water. Her head pounded, her back ached, and inside, it felt like something was breaking. She climbed into the yellow Danfo bus, too tired to even care that the seats smelled of sweat and petrol. She leaned against the rattling window, eyes closing, body heavy, and then the world changed. As the bus hummed through Third Mainland Bridge, she opened her eyes and saw it. People, every single one like candles, flickering flames hovering over their heads, some steady, some sputtering, some barely there. And when she looked at her reflection in the bus window, her heart froze. Above her head was a tiny light, weak, trembling like it could vanish at any moment. Ayoka could not breathe. Her fingers dug into her seat. She wanted to scream, to wake up, to be normal again, but then she felt it, a cold hand on her shoulder. Ayoka turned abruptly, and behind her sat an old man, motionless with a sad look on his face. She looked above his head and noticed that there was nothing, no light like the others. It was as if his light had quenched, and Ayoka sat there horrified. The entire bus grew silent, as if everyone had paused. The strange man moved closer, his voice cold like ice as he began to speak. Your flame is almost out, Ayoka, and if you don't do something about it, something terrible will happen. Before Ayoka could speak, the bus jolted and the brakes screeched. Startled, she looked to see what had happened, but by the time she turned around, the man was gone, and Ayoka could not understand what was happening. She got to her stop and stumbled off the bus, her heart pounding as her legs trembled. And when she glanced at the glass window of a closed shop nearby, she saw it again, her flame, her life, her very essence, flickering weakly as though she were a candle about to burn out. Ayoka stumbled home that night, her breath shallow as her eyes darted to every passerby. Now she could not unsee it. Everywhere she looked, people's flames hovered, glowing, dimming, sputtering. Her neighbor, Mama Shade, a woman in her 50s who sold akara by the roadside, carried a small but steady flame, holding firm despite the Lagos wind. Chuka, the flashy entrepreneur who parked his car by the gate, had a massive flame above his head. But the worst was Ayoka herself. Every time she caught a reflection, her flame looked smaller and weaker, as though time itself was running out. She locked her apartment door, dropped her bag, and stood in the dark for a very long time. Her mind kept replaying the strange man's words. Your flame is almost out, and if you don't do something about it, something terrible will happen. But who was he? And why did he even have no flame at all? The next morning, Ayoka dragged herself to work, hoping that the previous day had been a hallucination brought on by stress. But the flames were still there. When she stepped into the bank, her stomach twisted. The entire office looked like a graveyard of dying candles. Most of her co-workers, their flames were faint, twitching like fragile matches in the wind. Even her boss, Mr. Folarin, the man whose voice could silence an entire room, had a flame so weak that it barely swayed. Ayoka sat at her desk, staring blankly, her pulse racing. She realized something horrifying. This wasn't just about her anymore. Everyone was burning out, and nobody could see it but her. That night, Ayoka barely slept, but when sleep finally came, it dragged her into something she could not explain. She found herself standing barefoot in a very beautiful house, one that she had never seen before, but felt oddly familiar. There were 5 doors ahead of her, each marked with a glowing symbol. She couldn't read them, but her body moved forward as though pulled by something unseen. She arrived at the first door and opened it. Inside was her childhood room. Everything was just as it used to be. The cracked Barbie mirror, the purple walls, the small reading lamp that flickered. On the bed sat a little girl, herself no older than 9, holding a birthday cake with no candles. Ayoka watched, frozen, as the little girl whispered, "They forgot again," then blew out nothing, and the room went dark. Ayoka stumbled back in tears and moved to the second door. This time, she saw herself in university, smiling, dancing, laughing with friends, but slowly, everyone turned away from her. One by one, they vanished until Ayoka stood in the center of the scene, completely alone. Shaking, she turned to the third door. Inside was a high-rise office. Hers. She sat at a desk, typing as people walked by applauding her, clapping and praising her, calling her the boss lady or the successful woman, but none of them had faces. And Ayoka, she kept typing, even as her body withered. Her fingers bled onto the keyboard, yet she smiled and typed harder. She screamed and slammed the door. The fourth door creaked open slowly. She was wearing a wedding gown, alone, in front of a mirror. No groom, just her own reflection. Tired, older, eyes empty. She whispered, I waited. I waited too long. Now it's just me. Ayoka stepped back in panic, gasping, her pulse racing. Then she turned to the fifth door. It glowed faintly, shaking slightly, like something was behind it. Her hand trembled as she reached for the handle, but before she could open it, she woke up. Ayoka sat up in bed, drenched in sweat, her breathing shallow. Something felt wrong. She ran to the mirror and froze. Her flame was gone. There was no light above her head. Nothing, just her reflection. So she backed away, knocking over a stool as her heart thundered in her ears. Ayoka rushed out of her apartment, down the stairs, barefoot and breathless. People were walking by as usual. She caught sight of Mama Shadi, who was frying akara in the distance. A delivery man stood close to her entrance as he made some deliveries to her new neighbor. Chuka was polishing his car as usual, and Ayoka noticed that none of them had their flames on their heads. She clutched her chest as she heaved a sigh of relief. For a moment, she thought that her light had gone out, like the man that she met on the bus. Ayoka was so relieved to realize that she was not alone. However, she could not help but wonder what the flame signified, especially seeing how weak her flame was in comparison to the others that she saw. She arrived work hours later, still trembling. The office buzzed like any other day, but Ayoka could not focus. Her screen blurred, her ears rang, her thoughts spun like a broken fan. The doors, the dream, the missing flame, the mystery behind the fifth door in her dream. Ayoka sat there deep in her thoughts when a voice called her from behind. Ayoka, the voice said as she turned. It was Onome, her colleague, the only person at work who did not compete or gossip. You okay? You look like you saw a ghost. Onome said to Ayoka, who forced a smile as she assured her that she was fine. She wanted to tell Onome everything about the man on the bus, about the flames, the dream, the doors, the missing light, but she didn't. She could not, because how could she explain to Onome that she saw a flame on her head the previous day? Ayoka could not risk anyone calling her mad, so she pretended to be fine, despite all the torment that she was going through. She arrived home that evening and met her mother, who had come to pay her a surprise visit. She looked so excited, but Ayoka was not in the mood to see her mother, not because she did not love her, but because she knew exactly what was coming. The familiar pressure and the inevitable question of when she was finally getting married. Ayoka was so shocked to see her mother conversing with her neighbor Dami, who lived in the flat next door. Dami moved in 6 months ago, and during this time, Ayoka had only spoken to him once, and that was the day that he moved in, when Ayoka returned home from work to find boxes stacked up in front of his flat. She briefly welcomed him to the neighborhood and never got to speak with him again. Now, standing here, Ayoka wondered why her mother was chatting with her neighbor. She knew how intrusive her mother could be and feared the damage that she could have done. Her mother turned sharply when she noticed her coming. Ayoka, you're back, she said as she urged her to come greet the neighbor. He's such a respectful young man, she said to Ayoka, who forced a smile and greeted Dami. However, there was something distant in his eyes, although he smiled back at her. Ayoka could not shake off the feeling that something was definitely off. Do you know he's not married? Her mother whispered in her ears, not caring that Dami was standing right there before them. Ayoka pulled her mother into the house. She could not risk her mother turning her into a desperate woman in the eyes of her neighbor, a man that she had only spoken to once before this day. Ayoka stood in her apartment with her mother, who could not stop talking about her neighbor. He's tall, handsome, and responsible, she said to Ayoka, who rolled her eyes and walked into the kitchen. Her mother followed her closely as she tried to convince her to give her neighbor a chance. He's single, and I told him that you're single too. Who knows? Maybe God brought him here for you, she said to Ayoka, who froze and pleaded with her mother not to meddle in her love life. Love life, you say? Her mother barked as she asked Ayoka when last she was in a relationship, but Ayoka ignored her completely as she served her dinner. She went off to bed, still troubled by all the strange things that had been happening. Ayoka refused to tell her mother about the flames, She went off to bed and found herself in a huge mansion again. This time, she was standing in front of the fifth door. However, when she tried to open the door, she woke up from her sleep. Ayoka sat up in bed, gasping for breath, her heart pounding as sweat trickled down her forehead. Again, the dream had dragged her to the fifth door, but just like the night before, she woke up before even opening it. Ayoka laid there in silence as her alarm bell went off. It was weekend and she decided to stay back in bed, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. She had barely rested, but her mother was already up, humming in the kitchen as she prepared her favorite akara and pap. Ayoka stayed in bed all morning. She began to hear a huge commotion outside and rushed out to check what it was. It was a woman accusing her neighbor Dami of sleeping with all of her friends. "You useless man," the woman said as she flung a female underwear in his face, asking who it belonged to. Her mother also stood there frozen as she could not believe the kind of man that she tried to force on her daughter. She apologized to Ayoka, who began to tell her all that had been happening. Ayoka poured everything out to her mother, hoping that she might offer some kind of clarity or meaning. But when she finished, her mother sat there shocked. She sat in stunned silence, holding her wrapper tightly around her shoulders, her eyes wide in complete shock as Ayoka finished recounting the events of the last few days: the flickering flames, the man on the bus, the dreams, the doors, especially the fifth one that she could never open. For the first time in a very long while, her mother did not scold her. She didn't ask about marriage. She didn't mention children. She just stared at Ayoka, fear and confusion dancing in her eyes. "Ayoka," she said quietly, "this is not ordinary." Ayoka nodded in agreement. Her mother stood slowly, walked to the window and looked out at the bright sky. "You need to pray," her mother finally said, turning to her. "You need to seek understanding. This thing is not physical. That fifth door, whatever is behind it, Ayoka, it holds the key." Ayoka did not argue. She knew that time had come for her to speak to the one person who had the answer to her questions. That night, after her mother left, Ayoka went down on her knees and said a prayer. "God, if you're there, I need answers." Then she fell asleep, and for the third time, she was back in the beautiful mansion. But this time, the house was not quiet. The walls trembled and the floor began to crack. She stood there terrified as the fifth door swung open on its own. Ayoka's heart pounded as she stepped through it. However, what she saw on the other side made her collapse to her knees in terror. It was not a room, it was a mirror, a full-length mirror, glowing with soft white light, and in it she saw herself, not the broken woman she had become, but the version of her that she had long forgotten. Ayoka smiled in that reflection. She glowed, not because of makeup or filters, but because she was whole again. Then the reflection spoke to her, not with words from her mouth, but from deep within her spirit. "You've lived your life trying to be who everyone needed, but you forgot who you were before the world told you who to be. You've poured yourself into others, work, family, expectations, until there was nothing left. That's why your flame is dying." Ayoka's lips trembled as she realized the truth. She had given her all to everyone else except herself. She asked her reflection what she had to do, and her reflection said something that she never expected. "Forgive your father and open up your heart to love. Most importantly, remember," the voice said as Ayoka woke up from her sleep in tears. For all these years, she had held a deep grudge for her late father, who treated her like a burden, constantly reminding her that he never wanted daughters. Ayoka was humiliated by her father, who withheld money from her to punish her. Ayoka could not afford pads or basic supplies because her father refused to provide for her, not because he did not have the money, but because he saw her as useless. Her mother, in her little capacity, tried to provide for her, but her father made it so difficult. He withheld money from her and banned her from ever working. Ayoka grew up with a deep-seated hatred for men. She tried to give love a chance once, but the man accused her of stealing his money when she came to clean his house. He swore that he left a huge amount of money in his drawer and accused Ayoka of stealing it. The young man pushed Ayoka out of his house, calling her a thief. However, the next morning, he arrived at his office and realized that he left the money in the office. Although he came back to apologize to Ayoka, she never looked at men the same way again. Ayoka made up her mind to be successful. She buried herself in her work, never giving love a chance, not knowing that her candle was burning out. But now everything made sense. The dreams, the dying flame, even the fifth door. It wasn't just a warning, it was a cry from her soul, begging to be freed from the weight she had carried for so long. Ayoka sat in her bed, tears flowing down her cheek, but for the first time, they weren't tears of confusion. They were cleansing, a deep aching release. Ayoka whispered into the stillness of her room, forgiving her father for all that he did. And as soon as she did that, her heart felt lighter. Ayoka had been walking through life like a house without a foundation, polished outside but crumbling within. But the moment she released the pain, the moment she let go of the bitterness that had silently drained her for decades, her soul remembered how to breathe again. She called her boss that morning and asked for a 1 week leave. Ayoka, for the first time in her life, took charge of her life. She decided to do something that truly made her happy. She spent her time in the orphanage close to her house, bringing joy to the children around. Ayoka remembered walking past the orphanage the other day on her way back from work and noticed how dim the children's lights were. Every single child inside had a flame, but they were faint, flickering, barely clinging to life. Ayoka stood outside the rustling gate and wept because now she understood. These children were not just orphans, they were forgotten flames. Just like herself, Ayoka visited them every evening, and the more she did so, the happier she became. One evening, as she was dancing and singing with the children, a handsome man arrived at the orphanage and could not take his eyes off her. His name was Toby, and he was once an orphan who lived in the same orphanage. Every month, he made it his duty to visit the children there, knowing how lonely it could be. However, he was not expecting to see a beautiful woman playing with the children. He approached Ayoka, who in that moment saw the flames again, burning so brightly, not only her flame but his. It was brief, but Ayoka knew that she had finally found herself. The weeks that followed were one of the best, as Ayoka finally found love in the most unexpected place. Her light began to burn brighter, and Ayoka learned her valuable lesson that healing does not always come in grand gestures, but in the quiet moments when we forgive. The lesson to be learned from this story is that when we ignore our wounds and wear masks just to please the world, we slowly burn ourselves out. Like Ayoka, many people are praised on the outside but crumbling on the inside. But healing begins the moment we stop pretending, when we confront the pain we buried, forgive those who hurt us, and remember who we truly are. Our light begins to return. I hope you enjoyed the story.